Good morning, everybody. My name's Declan Black. I'm the managing partner at Mason Hayes & Curran. I see we're now at just over 170 participants, so I will end my pregnant pause and begin. It's always difficult to know at a webinar when the room is full, but I think 170 is a good start. You're very, very welcome to our session this morning. This is one of 3 in the MHC investigation series, which we're hosting with the Association of Corporate Investigators. This is the first, the second part is next Tuesday, and the third part will be after the summer break in September. These usually are in-person gatherings, but virtual reach actually goes further with the numbers that are signed up for this, albeit without, I suppose, the warmth of personal contact, which we've all missed for a number of months now. Investigations is obviously of major interest to firms such as Mason Hayes & Curran. We're very active in the field in all sorts of areas, from data to charities, to children, to workplace issues, to old-fashioned fraud, to new types of fraud, to health and safety, and to major incidents. It's a very growing practice for us, and it's one where most of our clients have a requirement that comes up in the oddest way from time to time. Investigations can be internally commissioned, they can be requested by external stakeholders, they can be initiated by agencies, and they are often multiple in the sense that one incident can give rise to several overlapping investigations. And the management of those, and I suppose the productive utilization of investigations, is obviously a critical issue and something which we would obviously urge people to take very seriously and take appropriate legal advice in relation to those issues as they arise. That's the end of my little ad, and I am now only involved to very, very warmly welcome both the hosting MHC partners, Muireann Dennehy and Liam Guidera, but more particularly our guests for today. So the first panel that we have today will be Detective Chief Superintendent Michael Gubbins, who's the Chief Bureau Officer in the Criminal Assets Bureau. Some of you may have read about their activities yesterday. And he'll be accompanied by Stephen Young, who is CEO of the Association of Corporate Investigators and the Head of Fraud and Investigations at Lombard Odier, a private bank. That will be chaired by MHC partner Liam Guidera, who's a veteran of many investigations, including representing no less than 2 Taoiseach at tribunals of inquiry. And that will be followed by a panel discussion with Detective Sergeant Dan MacGinty of the Anti-Corruption Unit in the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau, Declan Walsh, a Director of Forensic and Investigation Services at RSM, Kevin Hart, Associate Managing Director, Business Intelligence and Investigations at Kroll, and Mark Whitehead, a Director at Managed Services in Deloitte. And that will be moderated by MHC partner Muireann Dennehy. And after that, there'll be opportunity for Q&A. I know some questions have already been submitted, and we hope that we will have a good degree of interaction with you and our panelists. So that is me done. I see we're up to 227 participants. Congratulations to the 50 who have missed my intro and advertisement. And without any further comment from me, I'm delighted to pass you over to my partner, Liam Guidera.
Thanks very much, Declan. Good morning, everyone. You're very welcome to this seminar. And we're delighted to be joined by our panelists this morning. And I'm joined by Michael Gubbins, the Bureau Chief Officer in the Criminal Assets Bureau, and by Stephen Young, our co-host of the Association of Corporate Investigators. And I suppose Michael personifies the most visible manifestation of criminal enforcement in the economic crime field. And we're very grateful to Michael for taking time out of a hectic work schedule this morning. And if I could turn just to Stephen first, our co-host. Stephen is joining us from Geneva. And just to give you a little background in relation to Stephen, Stephen is the CEO of the Association of Corporate Investigators. For 20 years, he worked in law enforcement with the City of London Police Fraud Squad, and he worked in the entire spectrum of areas, including banking fraud, bribery, corruption, anti-money laundering. And then he moved to Citigroup and Barclays, and now presently Lombard and Odier, where he is head of fraud investigations and group compliance. So I think, Stephen, that's your backstory. So would you like to tell us a little bit about ACI, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you, Liam. Well, first of all, that introduction makes me feel quite old, to be honest with you. But firstly, let me thank you personally, and Mason, Hayes and Curran, for supporting the ACI with participation in these events. I mean, I'm really pleased to be here, you know, if only virtually from my attic. So the Association of Corporate Investigators, so they could best be described as a relatively new startup association. It was formed by myself, along with other corporate investigation team heads, really for the benefit of the corporate investigations community. I mean, collectively, we identified a gap in the association's landscape. There wasn't really anything out there which covered primarily in-house corporate investigators. So what do we do, and what are we going to try to do in the future? So we're currently organizing networking events, workshops, symposiums, and what we're trying to do is develop an accredited corporate investigators qualification as part of our education and training pathway. And of course, we're going to look in the future to launch a more formal membership. And what we want to do is we just aspire to deliver all the normal services that an association would deliver for the corporate investigations community. So should people listening wish to get in touch or simply join our mailing list, you know, then please visit our website and drop us a note. It's www.my-aci.com. Well, thank you, Liam.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Michael, turning to yourself, if I could just give our viewers a little background. I think you have experience now spanning more than 25 years working in economic crime exclusively within Garda Síochána, and primarily that has been in the area of computer forensics and cybercrime. Michael was appointed as the first head of the National Cybercrime Bureau, and then to his current position as recently as the 5th of May. Michael is involved with various Europol and European cybercrime groups, and he's currently the chair of the EU Cybercrime Task Force. So Michael, we're delighted to have you, and thanks again for taking time out of your many duties. I know that CAB published their annual report for last year in the last few days, and I think many of those attending this morning might be aware of that. But could you give us an overview, Michael, of CAB, its role, its functions, and if you like, your current priorities?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank yourself, Liam, and Declan for this opportunity this morning to speak to your own people, and obviously the people that are out there, the 270 odd. But this gives us an opportunity to explain the role and function of the criminal asset. And I suppose we'll start, it began in 1996. So it's over 24 years in existence. And it's a body corporate in its own right. So it's separate from the Garda organisation. It's separate from the Department of Justice, Revenue and Social Welfare. Yes, we are co-located here in Harcourt Square, along with the other bureaus and units attached to the Garda Special Crime Operations. CAB itself is made up of members of Garda Síochána, people from Revenue Taxes and Revenue Customs, Social Welfare. We're supported in our everyday work by people from the department, supplied by the Department of Justice. And also we have forensic accountants here, analysts, and we also have access to a Bureau Legal Officer who's attached to the Criminal Assets Bureau. We're also co-located with people from the Chief State Solicitor's Office. So they work, their primary function is to work on cases that we produce, and they bring them then to the High Court for us. Our main function in life is to deny and deprive criminals of any assets that they have acquired through their criminal activities. And it's not necessarily the first act that they did, it's how how is that multiplied, and can they explain the origins of it? And if we can get criminality on it, we will take it from them. We'll go to the High Court. But as I said, we've also got revenue powers here. We've also got social welfare powers. So when we look at a target, we look at a proceeds of crime, but there's also powers available to us from the revenue side and also from social welfare.
Very good. So I mean, it's truly a multidisciplinary exercise, and you span the criminal and the civil law regimes, really, don't you?
Absolutely. All the proceeds of crime cases are taken in the civil court, in the High Court. We have available to us the full forces of all the bodies that are represented in CAB. So, for example, yesterday we would have had the other bureaus attached to the Organised and Special Crime section. We had the Economic Crime Bureau, Protective Services, Immigration, the Emergency Response Unit. Equally, we had support from social welfare and from customs. So when CAB go on a search or we go on an operation, we've got the full backing and the resources available from those other functions as well that we can bring with us. So, and the beauty of CAB, why it works is the guards, revenue and social welfare, they all sit in the room. They're on the one team. So if you can imagine, the guards are bringing their skill set and information and knowledge that they have. The revenue people are doing similar, both from taxes and the customs point of view, and also the social welfare. So I suppose it unified all the arms of the state and have all that intelligence and information, so that if we decide Liam is a target, we have all that information, and that's how we approach a target.
Great. Okay. So that really brings me, I suppose, to the theme of, this seminar, which is the collaboration and the relationship between people on the civil side, such as ourselves, people, be they clients or their professional advisors, and then the regulators and the law enforcement authorities. So, Stephen, could I just turn to you? I mean, you've had experience, obviously, of both. So, wearing your day job hat, and an issue presents itself in work, and it's a critical matter, and it requires an immediate investigation and your involvement. What thoughts cross your mind as to how you're going to engage with, and the timing of how you engage with Michael and his colleagues?
Yeah, so basically then what you have in most of the big corporates, within their corporate investigation teams, there's a rich mix. I mean, it some way echoes what Michael was saying about a sort of a multidisciplined approach. So first of all, in the team, you'll have ex-law enforcement, forensic accountants, auditors, and certainly if they're not on the team, then of course, most corporates will employ outside specialists, some of whom are on your panel, which follows ours. So right from the get-go, looking at the circumstances of a case, then for sure, if there's clear evidence of criminality, then most corporates will have a policy. They'll have an executive committee, they'll have a head of legal, they'll very quickly make a decision if this is something that ought to properly be immediately reported to law enforcement because it's a crime. So when that mechanism kicks in, then for sure, generally on an investigation team where there have been people who have been ex-law enforcement, they're generally your chosen people to be the interface with the police in most countries around the world, because they understand how police operate, they know the criminal law standard. But of course, from a corporate perspective, there are many, many moving parts, not least the civil side. If there's contemplation of litigation, then for sure from the internal investigation, it can move into very complex space where one's got to respect privilege. And also, if it's cross-jurisdictional, touching many countries, then the areas of complexity just increase. So it really does take quite a big team. It takes a lot of disciplines involved. And generally, through speaking to colleagues in the ACI, relations with the police globally for these types of cases generally very, very good, generally very cooperative.
Good. Okay. So Michael, from your perspective then, and I appreciate this isn't, necessarily something that's exclusive to CAB, and it probably relates, even more so to the National Economic Crime Bureau, and we'll have a panelist on that in the second half. But in terms of your engagement with people like Stephen and ourselves, and you have a lot of people on this morning who are, accountants, lawyers, compliance officers, risk officers. How does CAB seek to engage with that community?
I mean, this morning would be an example of that, to reach out and to explain to people how we function and what we do. You spoke earlier about there's a civil element and there's a criminal element, and most of our actions are taken on a civil level of proof. So therefore, we don't actually need a statement from anybody. So somebody can make anonymous communication with us to info@cab.ie and explain and kind of point us in a direction. We'll take that. We have an intelligence and an analysis unit that will look at the information and build a case around it and sees it worthy of becoming a target. Sometimes we might need statements if for a criminal investigation, but at which stage that's probably more something that the Economic Crime Bureau and Detective Sergeant Dan MacGinty will deal with. But if people ring us up or they contact us, the person who contacts us does not have to go to court.
And Michael, tell us a little bit about your divisional asset profilers.
So as part of our outreach, we have divisional asset profilers who are trained guards. They're trained by the Criminal Assets Bureau here itself. And their function is to identify criminality and wealth throughout the Garda regions. They will then submit a report to the Criminal Assets Bureau, and we'll assess that. And then we have an admissions group once a week and decide, is that person worthy of being a target? And then we'll bring them in, we'll allocate that to a team room for further investigation. And they will be they'll be made available to people to the public as well if they want to contact them. If they want to speak to them quietly, they can contact our local Garda station and try and identify who is that person. We don't have a list up, but if they contact our local Garda station, they can speak to them, or they can write in anonymously, either, as I said, to CAB or to the local Garda station. But it's proven very useful to us because it does identify criminality and wealth, and it also supports us then in our cases. We can task them to maybe do a background report on an individual or a target that we're interested in.
Okay. And Michael, I suppose you're speaking there of, if you like, informal communications by, citizens, or, it could be professional advisors. But in terms of the formal reporting, I know this is something that causes people, a lot of concern, particularly accountants and lawyers and indeed clients, their obligations to report under Section 19 of the Criminal Justice Act. Can you just give us briefly your perspective on that, as to how you see that operating and what you expect of people making those reports?
Yeah, in relation to Section 19s, I'm only here just shy of 2 months, and I haven't seen any yet. I know that the Economic Crime Bureau do receive a lot of Section 19 reports, primarily from the banking industry. And previously, in my previous roles, I saw them also being made in relation to cyber issues and cyber matters. Offhand, I can't recollect any coming from your industry. I'm not saying that they weren't made, but off the top of my head, I can't name any. But again, primarily they would go towards the Economic Crime Bureau side of the house. But if one came in here, yeah, we'd look at it, and sure, we would assess it, and then obviously provide it might be a case that we might need to go and talk to a group of people, and this is an opportunity to speak to you, or maybe to the legal industry, to explain maybe how the Section 19 can work and can be used to everybody for collaboration in the future.
Okay, well, look, I think we will deal with that. We'll try to deal with that in a little more detail in the second part. Thanks, Michael. Steve, could I just ask you, I mean, sitting in Geneva, in many ways the crossroads of so much, trade and particularly the financial services industry, what trends are you seeing at the moment in terms of economic crime and, topics that concern you and your peers?
Well, for sure, Liam, what we're seeing is financial misstatement. Fraud seems to be right up there, emerging out of the COVID-19 crisis, with corporates, quite frankly, to coin an old phrase, under pressure to make the numbers. We've just seen Wirecard in Germany hit the international financial press and beyond. The scale of financial misstatement, it comes in many, many different forms. So I would say from a corporate perspective, that's the number one we're seeing at the minute. Okay,
thanks. And Michael, I mean, do you want to give us an insight? I know you're only in the role a few short weeks, but do CAB see any particular trends there?
Primarily, a lot of the, I suppose, the original crime which creates these funds and the assets that the criminals use is drugs based. The second one would be theft and fraud. A lot of the assets are, I suppose, they literally wear it on their wrist, whether it's a watch, a handbag, clothing. It's easily transportable. They're high value items, unlikely to catch the attention maybe of customs, and allows them to go from one jurisdiction to the other freely. Sometimes it can be used, I suppose, as a form of currency in itself, to pay debts, to repay, they also like to drive high value cars, quality cars, the importation of cars. And just to come back to the previous question, I suppose, like all things in life, the Criminal Assets Bureau, proceeds of crime, economic crime, it's not just a matter for law enforcement. It is collaboration between the various industries and law enforcement to work together, and sometimes you can bunch academia to help people. There's a number of pillars in it. So the Criminal Assets Bureau can't do it on its own. Law enforcement can't do it on its own. Stephen works in a corporate world. He can only bring it so far, but for criminal prosecutions, then they need to report it and to work with law enforcement, and working together, we can have successful outcomes, whether that's the identification of assets which are the proceeds of crime, or successful criminal outcome.
Very good. Thanks, Michael. Well, I think, that brings us back again to our theme that, these are all supporting disciplines, really, that are there to help each other, and that ultimately our role, I suppose, is to try and secure restitution for, the victims of the crime. And as you say, Michael, your role principally is to deny and deprive the wrongdoer of their profit. Okay.
Absolutely. And I suppose just to assuage any worries that your own industry would have, or some of the people listening online, that we're very conscious of the fact when we do what we call a professional search, whether it's to solicitors or accountants, that we're discreet. People go in their shirt and tie, their suit. They don't look like guards. I can't say that because I always look like a guard, and we're very conscious of that, of working with people. Solicitors, the legal industry, criminals will use you probably for conveyancing, and other matters. So we're very conscious. We have the warrant that goes, the Section 14 warrant that we use, but we're very conscious that we're walking into a legitimate place of employment and work, and we don't want to disrupt that or cause any concerns for yourselves.
Sure. Okay. Michael, thanks very much. Michael, and I thank you both very much for your time. I wish we had more time. There's obviously a lot to talk about, but we will return to it again in another forum. So thank you both. I'd like to hand over now to my colleague, Murren Dennehy, and Murren will conduct the next panel discussion. Murren works with me as a partner in our investigations and white-collar crime section. Murren was recently selected by Global Investigations Review as a member of their 40 Under 40 group. Her practice focuses on corporate and international investigations, particularly in the financial services area. She has experience working in global law practices in London and New York, and Murren has also prosecuted in the UN International Criminal Tribunal. So Murren, I'll hand over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Liam, and thank you both to Steve and Michael for that very interesting and insightful discussion. This morning, as we've said throughout, we're talking about crisis management, planning investigations, and looking at our law enforcement. While we've looked at law enforcement and focused on that for the first part, I want to now look over to the corporate side of things. And to join me, we have an esteemed group of panelists, each of whom are real experts in their field. And the reason we brought these people together is that in the investigation space in particular, it's very important to collaborate with other experts in the field. As lawyers, we only form part of the investigation sphere. There are forensic accountants, actual investigators, former law enforcement, and so on. And the field is quite wide, and hence the reason for bringing everyone together here today. So to introduce you to my panelists, I have Detective Sergeant Dan MacGinty. He is in the Anti-Corruption Unit at the GNECB. Now, for the internationals amongst you, that's a Garda National Economic Crime Bureau. He has extensive experience in investigating and assisting with the prosecution of fraud and crime. He spent over a decade as what was formerly known as the Fraud Unit. Next up, I have, and in no particular order, is Declan Walsh. Declan is a Director of Forensic Investigation Services at RSM. RSM, for the internationals amongst you, is a leading Irish-based accounting and business advisory firm. He's worked on several investigations, both domestic and cross-border, and he's been there over 10 years, and prior to which he was at Grant Thornton. Next, I have Kevin Hart. Kevin is an Associate Managing Director of Business Intelligence and Investigations at Kroll. Kroll is a division of Duff & Phelps and one of the very few investigations and risk management firms here in Dublin. They just opened up here last September, and Kevin's practice focuses very much on cross-border investigations, in particular what he terms as frontier jurisdictions, and that's probably by reference to his native South Africa and the wider African continent. And then last but not least, we have Mark Whitehead, who is a Director of Deloitte in London. He focuses on cyber practice, and he leads Deloitte's consumer breach support business. He spends most of his time, though, helping clients in the recovery from cyber incidents and protecting them from any further cyber breaches. So thank you all, welcome. Just to let everyone know, there is a Q&A function on the webinar here this morning. You'll see at your bottom middle corner, I suppose. If you do have questions for our panelists, please type them in, and we will try and address them as we go through. So in Ireland over the last few years, we've seen a lot of change in the economic and investigation space in particular. Most of that arose from the 2017 government white-collar crime package that was led by our former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar in response to effectively a review of our bribery and corruption legislation and activity as well. And basically we were found to be lacking. And so since then, there have been a series of reforms that have engaged us as investigations lawyers and practitioners, and that will continue to go on into the future months. So we have a new Bribery Act, or what we call the Corruption Offences Act. Effectively, it's a beefed up version of the UK Bribery Act, and so there's much higher standard there, both in terms of prosecution and defence. We also will have a new agency to effectively enforce that act in the form of a potential corporate enforcement authority that will come later this year, and there'll be a series of other reforms. Now, first and foremost, to Dan MacGinty, can you tell us about the GNECB, what you do, and in particular what the Anti-Corruption Unit does?
Yeah, the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau was formed in 1996 as the Garda Bureau of Fraud Investigation. And I suppose the role of the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau, GNECB, is the investigation, prevention and disruption of serious economic crime. So only really crime of national importance or is complex in law or procedure. We also support local investigations conducted by trained fraud investigators around the country. where they might need support and expert guidance on how to conduct their investigations. We've been responsible for the investigation of bribery and corruption since 1996 and before. But in 2017, we decided to set up a dedicated anti-corruption unit, which is focused exclusively on the investigation of foreign bribery and corruption. And that's the unit I'm in charge of at the moment. And we also investigate bribery and corruption instances of national importance, as well as corruption, which would be match fixing. And obviously we have an outreach function, which is why I'm here, educating the people about our existence and our activities. And we also support local bribery and corruption investigations as well.
And you mentioned that you work with foreign, in relation to foreign bribery. Do you work also with foreign investigation agencies and other international agencies?
Yes, we have a very close working relationship with our international partners, particularly in the UK and Europe, the Serious Fraud Office, the National Crime Agency, and through international organisations such as Europol and Interpol. We also have a role through the OECD, where we liaise with our law enforcement partners throughout the world. So investigating the likes of foreign bribery obviously is not an easy task and involves many other jurisdictions. So, it's very important to stay in contact with all the other agencies. And very often our cases don't involve just one jurisdiction. So they occurred in another jurisdiction outside of Ireland. They might have involved an Irish company or an Irish citizen, but equally they might also involve citizens of other countries that are investigating. So very often it's not unusual for one of our cases, there could be 3 different countries involved in the investigation.
And I know, Declan, you've done a lot of cross-border investigations work, but as a forensic accountant, can you tell me how you become involved in an investigation, what you focus on in particular, and at what point you start liaising with the likes of Dan or potentially CAB that we previously discussed?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mara. The majority of our work, I suppose, in the financial forensic space would tend to come from, I suppose, a selection of either protected disclosures, whistleblowing within an organisation, the instance of financial irregularities which are identified either internally or by an external auditor. You'd be surprised at how often that can be, I suppose, an inadvertent identification of some financial irregularity. And then sometimes, I suppose, in the context of dispute resolution. We find ourselves working with law enforcement and other regulatory bodies such as the revenue commissioners quite regularly. And we tend to, there's this, I suppose, quandary in a lot of investigations as to, well, when do you meet the burden of Section 19 and when do you make your report? And often you find yourself making a report at a reasonably early stage of the suspected criminality that may be involved in a matter you're investigating. And then as the investigation develops, making further reports and working alongside, I suppose, in Garda Síochána in a lot of cases. And that can be a symbiotic relationship. And there are mutual benefits there if 2 investigations in terms of a civil and a criminal are progressing at the same time. And we tend to keep in touch, and I suppose clients won't want you to get in the way of a criminal prosecution. But equally, there's a requirement to be able to bring your own investigation to a close as well. So we do tend to stay in contact with Garda Síochána throughout investigations like that. And I have yet to come across a client who hasn't wanted us to provide full cooperation and any and all assistance to law enforcement. I suppose we do a lot of work in the not-for-profit space, and there would be a desire there that if a civil wrongdoing has happened that has a criminal element, then the perpetrator be brought to justice, I suppose. And it's useful as well from a mutual learning perspective, in that we're able to share methodologies and discuss with each other as investigations progress as to what we're doing. And I think I've certainly over the years picked up a few tricks of the trade, if I might, from law enforcement, from the Garda and from CAB. I'd like to think they might have done so as well from our side of the table. But certainly, I think as well as that, and maybe some of the lower grade frauds, and Garda Síochána don't have an endless resource of accounting within the organisation. So Section 19 really provides them with an ability, I suppose, to draw on our profession in terms of the reports that we make in assisting them. And that's, I suppose, it's all for the greater good, really.
Yeah, no, it's true. And for those internationals amongst us, Section 19 is basically the self-reporting requirement of any potential crime in Ireland. It's an obligation that's statutory, and and something that's widely kind of used around industry. And I think you're right in saying, and I think it's, you know, from my experiences, I was at in-house with Morgan Stanley as head of investigations in London for a while, and there again it's very much a collaborative process when you're dealing with your regulator, because you need to understand what they want from you, and equally you don't want to get to a loggerhead situation where it's, you know, it's more accusatory than collaborative. And I think ultimately cooperation is where we get to the final point, and at the quickest pace, I think. And turning now to Mark, who's in London, and so in terms of your kind of cyber experience, I mean, we've talked a lot this morning about, you know, investigations and crime, and to what extent we look at various investigations in the process of reporting to law enforcement agencies. But how do then cyber or data breaches, for example, differ to your kind of mainstream investigations type?
Thanks, Brian. So I think there are many similarities. There are a couple of differences, but a lot of those differences stem from, I guess, the relative experience of investigating cyber incidents and some of the new agencies and supervisory authorities that have been set up. And so some people are still trying to figure out how to effectively, if you will, police GDPR, but there are many similarities. I would, in terms of sort of lessons that we've learned, I think number one, again, it's especially important to be proactive with regulators and law enforcement agencies, especially before you take material action. So make people aware early and give them the opportunity to provide input, even if they choose not to. Always important. And just like a traditional investigation, document everything, both the decisions and the reasons for those decisions, and make sure you have that audit trail. One area that we do find is not exclusively, but can be quite different, is around third-party access and the number and different parties that may require access to your organization. And generally, again, in the middle of a crisis or an incident, it's not the time to try and start putting third-party access in place for the first time. So I'd encourage everyone to think about, are they ready now to enable third-party access to both systems, to people, and to facilities? That often gets forget. We've seen instances where getting that moving can take 2 to 3 weeks and bring significant delays to an investigation. And I think, sorry, Ryan.
So when you say third parties, is that talking about the likes of, you know, Deloitte, Kroll, everyone, you know, represented here today, or is it other third parties or clients or so on? I mean, who are the third parties that might need access?
So you could talk about law enforcement agencies. They could be supervisory authorities. You could have a number of different third-party technical organizations from a cyber perspective. Mm-hmm. So you might have specific pen testers. You might have someone looking to conduct a forensic investigation. You might have a separate entity looking to help you recover systems that have suffered as a result of a hack. So there's a lot, but we've seen a lot more complexity in terms of third-party interaction. We've also seen, I guess as an aside, a lot of deviations from standard procedures given COVID-19. A lot of people fall back on the rule book with investigations and justify their actions based on standard procedures. So in some of the investigations that we've been conducting recently, there have been quite a lot of deviations that can be quite hard to justify. So again, a point of note to the audience in terms of making sure if there are deviations that you can justify why.
I see, thank you for that. I want to bring you now, Kevin, in. You're new to the Dublin market in terms of, well, the firm Kroll is. Can you tell our audience, you know, what Kroll is in terms of a firm, how it distinguishes against, you know, the other big accountancy and audit firms, and what your focus specifically is?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mirren, and the rest of the team. Kroll, I think, is unique globally. What we do is risk management. That is our primary reason for existing. We've been around almost 50 years, and we came out of New York with a focus on helping corporates investigate irregularities. And the firm has grown up, and we are, I think what sets us apart is we don't provide audit and tax services, so we can truly be independent in almost any situation. So the type of things we do that I think are unique and very valuable for clients include things such as business intelligence. It's getting behind what's obvious to the not so obvious. It's very important for you to know who you're getting into business with. If you're, for example, if you're expanding into a foreign jurisdiction, how do you choose a supplier, a third party, an agency to represent you? So getting to know who those people are very valuable. So we've developed a very sound methodology to assist clients to do that. Looking at from what was mentioned a little bit earlier, in terms of assets, I think one of our strongest areas is asset tracing. It's one thing being, hit with a fraud. There's another thing not being able to recover any of the lost cash. So I think we're very good at helping clients get into asset tracing. A cross-border complexity of asset tracing is another headache for most companies. We do have a lovely global network that we can rely on, and we have things like language skills out in almost all the jurisdictions that our clients operate in. In terms of the more niche parts of our business, security risk management. So we've got clients, for example, Irish clients that operate out in Africa, where the laws are in place, but they're not really governed or enforced that much. So they're very vulnerable to abuse out in those jurisdictions. So we help them put together security plans for executives who are maybe go traveling out there to visit the operations. Looking at the sort more systematic services that we do include compliance risk management. Again, writing policies is one thing, but actually executing compliance is, that there's a nuanced way to actually do it right, to do it effectively and cost effectively well. So going on to what Mark mentioned, cybersecurity is obviously a crazy big concern for almost all companies. In fact, before joining this call, I had a call with a listed company, and they had a pretty serious concern to start working on, and that included such things as possible identity theft, having to deal with the DPC in terms of breach notification. So if you're asking the question what sets us apart and makes us slightly different, are those unique services where we don't have to be worried about independence and conflicts. We do stand alone on a lot of these, and that's why I think we get a lot of referral work as well from audit and accounting firms where perhaps they service clients in a range of services, and we don't. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does indeed. Thank you very much. I just now want to focus moving forward onto the challenges that we face in investigations in each of our areas of fields of expertise. Declan, you mentioned that you engage with the likes of Dan on a Section 19 basis, from the outset, but throughout a potential investigation. What are the challenges that you are continually faced with, and that you'd like to see clients, I suppose, mitigate for you going forward in terms of any investigations you'd be involved in?
I think that the biggest challenge that I find with clients is the unanticipated amount of management time that goes into an investigation. And that could be an investigation that the client itself has in fact commissioned, where they haven't put a plan in place at the outset to say, look, what resources are we going to need to actually deal with this investigation? We've got either an internal or an external investigator involved. But what are they going to need to support them to execute this investigation and to dispose of it as efficiently as possible? And often you find a part of the way through that the client is being overwhelmed, that they're trying to continue to run their organization, be that a commercial enterprise or perhaps a state or not-for-profit, and they don't have the time to do the day job and to continue with the investigation. So one, I suppose, a top tip I give to anyone who either finds themselves subject of an investigation by an outside body or commissioning their own investigation is to spend that a little bit of time at the start and plan out the resources you're going to need. Put a team in place. You're probably going to need input from your finance, your IT function, your HR, your auditor, your external solicitors, in-house counsel. Put that plan in place and make sure you have the resources both to deal with the investigation, but also to continue the orderly running of your business and not to be overwhelmed during that time. And the other thing I'd say there is, in terms of reference of an investigation, particularly if you have the power to draft them yourself, if it's not been imposed upon you by an outside body. The terms of reference to me is the most important document in an investigation. Yeah. More important than the report that comes at the end. And really it's up to you to cut your cloth at the start and set the terms of reference in a way that will allow you to get through the subject matter you're investigating, to avoid going down, I suppose, rabbit holes and getting torn off in different directions, and to deal with the matter in the most efficient manner. A poor terms of reference can lead to an investigation getting bogged down, can lead to injunction, can lead to, in worst case scenario, the outcome being undermined or being set aside. So the key thing is there to look out for are setting a tight scope and an appropriate scope, making sure all your procedures are in place, and I suppose usually being guided by your either in-house counsel or your solicitors in that regard. And actually on that point, I suppose making sure that where an investigation is taking place, that you bring your lawyers in at the start and ensure that you have the chain of engagement set up properly so that legal privilege will apply. And I know Kevin and I'm sure Mark have come across these situations before where a client contacts you and looks to commence an investigation, and you're saying to them, stop, call your lawyers, ask them to call us. I had a meeting, I think late last year, where a client came in with a file full of information and handed it to me, and I handed it back and said, I don't want to see that. Let's get the letter of engagement in place. Let's get your lawyers in the room and let's talk. And I'm sure that the guys will have come across similar scenarios as well.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I've noticed that because we specialists in what we do, articulating allegations, for example, is often very difficult for clients. They think something has happened. What I've often seen is people jump to conclusions that something has actually happened. But that's the whole reason we're there, is to slow things down and say, let's articulate the allegations, let's put a plan together, let's make some good assumptions and then progress from that point. Sometimes clients can sensationalize something and they get ahead of themselves. So slowing down, articulating the allegations, putting it in writing, working with legal counsel to make sure it's a good legal basis to get going with the investigation is very important. So I agree, yes.
Dan, I want to bring you into this. So you're hearing how, that the corporates amongst us deal with this. I mean, what are your thoughts in listening to this conversation? I mean, are you saying, actually, hang on, guys, I want to be involved at the terms of reference stage? Or, at what point should we be coming to you?
Yeah, I suppose it goes back as well to the Section 9 report. And in a former role I had here at the Bureau, I actually received the majority of all the Section 19s that came here. So I got to have a flavour of exactly the kind of stuff that came in. Right. And really the quality of those reports, particularly early on, was very poor. And it's really about supplying us with the correct information. Like Kevin said, the allegation, what crime do you think actually occurred? And I'm not looking for a section of an act. Was it theft? Was it fraud? Do you think it's a bribe? The time of and date of when the offence allegedly occurred? Where it occurred? Does it concern other jurisdictions? So from the get-go, the Section 19, and that will allow us straight away when you get to Section 19 to decide, is it worthy for us getting involved very early on? Is it something that this Bureau should investigate? Or is it something that a local Garda station would have the capability to investigate? So, it's reporting standards, the first off. When you're conducting an internal investigation, if you believe a crime has committed at the outset of that investigation, so you think there's a theft or fraud or something under the Corruption Offences Act, report it to us as soon as practicable. I suppose that's what the Section 19 says you should do. And the idea behind that is an internal investigation, particularly where you may interview the suspect or who we might consider a suspect when we come on later on, could damage the criminal investigation down the road. We like to be the first people to put the damning evidence to the suspect, where we can get the best account and the most true account from someone we're interviewing. So it's just something to bear in mind. There's no harm coming to us at any stage. And we may, can say, look, this isn't something we're interested in, or continue with your internal investigation. We need more information before you report it. One other point as well is the persons that corporates put forward to then follow up and make a statement of complaint. Very often it's someone high up in a compliance department, or it might be a legal counsel or someone like that. And what we really need is the best witness. And the best witness is someone who has first-hand knowledge of what happened. So it's fine for someone to make a complaint on behalf of the organization, but we need to go to the source, the person who created the document, the person who handed the document over to us. We're conducting criminal investigations, so we have to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt. Unfortunately, we're not the cab. Luckily, they don't have to take witness statements. We do. So it's about identifying who those people are. And when something occurs, I suppose, the chronology of events, and that's something, companies could help with if they have a chronology of what happened and when.
I see. I suppose there is that balance for us that, you know, that there's no point in going to you when we still don't even have any idea as to what has gone on or who's involved or to what extent, you know, within the business it even interacts with various business points. So there is, I think, a fine balance to be, you know, sought between getting the right types of people involved, getting your plan in place, executing part of that plan and then involving you at the right point. And I know, Mark, this is part of your, you know, something that you have borne down on, pre-prepared framework and training in-house for corporates, especially on the cyber side of things, because those are frankly very complex environments. You know, you're dealing with servers where they might be held in other jurisdictions. You're talking about clouds, you're talking about various devices. Even just getting all of those materials gathered is a difficult task for anyone. What is your best advice then to clients in terms of getting themselves pre-prepared for any potential breach that may happen?
I think there's no magic potion to this one, Marianne. It's pretty much what you said in terms of plan, test, review, repeat. There's nothing. You know, the first time to test things out is not when in a reality of a live incident. You need to bring different third parties in to test you from different angles. I'd love to suggest that Deloitte is the perfect party for everything, but different perspectives from different organisations will challenge you as an individual organization in different ways. So put your plan together, test it from multiple angles, get different third parties in to challenge you, review the findings and then repeat it. Cyber incidents vary in many criteria. One, I think the helpful things recently about the cyber issues that are happening in terms of data breaches specifically is that the criteria for assessment and fines from the regulatory authorities are out there. If you look at White Paper 253 under Article 29, and I wish I didn't remember those numbers, but it lists out the 11 criteria that supervisory authorities are guided to use in the event of a data breach. So organizations, in terms of that, to your point, that planning and that preparation, the criteria, the assessments are already out there in public. So there's no excuse for organizations not knowing what they need to be able to prove. And the burden of proof now is on those organizations. I'd also suggest that the supervisory authorities are very much expecting you as an organization to learn from your competitors. So if your competitors have been through a situation, you're expected to have seen what's happened and learned from it. And the last point really, and I'll reinforce what Declan said, is in the event of these incidents, getting your plan out the drawer is vital, but move quickly, round up the key actors and the third parties, but please do it via your law firm to make sure that you do everything you can to protect privilege.
Yeah, privilege is the key one, really. I think we've seen that most recently in the Airbus big investigation. The reason the French prosecution services led that and had that fight with the US and the UK as to who would lead the prosecution is that the French would not leave the evidence leave the jurisdiction. They would not allow the US authorities to take it. And so it is key to both assess where your evidence is, talk to your lawyers and figure out the best place to have it, assessed or looked at within a prosecutorial kind of remit. I'm just now given time, I'm going to start looking at questions that we're getting in. I'm looking at one coming from Chloe Cass. Question for Kevin, please. How has Kroll found Ireland's corporate fraud landscape in comparison to other countries that Kroll exists in?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I saw it coming up. I've noticed, I've been in Ireland 4 years, going on 4 years now, and I've had the opportunity to work in all sorts of jurisdictions. And what I have noticed, the commonality is people know irregularities have occurred, but they don't want to say anything about it. Now, there's whole lots of theory, I guess, why, and I'm not an expert on that, but what that means is the fraud is happening, it's not being reported. Directors of companies and businesses who have a fiduciary duty to the company and to the shareholders are unaware of it because nobody wants to speak about it. Therefore, they go not investigated properly, or it builds up to such a pressure point that eventually it pops and you get something that's happened across in Germany, for example, with the Wirecard matter and other big matters. So that's the one thing I've noticed, and it's not unique to Ireland. This is everywhere, but I think what I'm trying to encourage is that, and it was mentioned, I think, by Dan, that you can come forward. You don't necessarily have to appear in the witness box just because you're coming forward with information. But I think I'd like to encourage everybody on the call to think about how they make fraud awareness in their firms more visible. because if people understand what it is, it's easier to identify. And if you can identify it, you feel a lot more comfortable taking that information forward to management. And I think it's every employee's duty to do that.
Kevin, I completely echo what you just said. It's a hugely important point. It's amazing how often people see things but don't report it. And again, I think it's incumbent on everyone to make sure that their policies and procedures are made public, that they're actively encouraged to bring things forward. Along the lines, you know, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it might be a duck.
Yeah.
You know, people see these things, but they don't bring it forward. And often that's because the policies and procedures of organizations aren't there in place and they're not encouraged to do so. It's critical in terms of timeliness to prevent things from growing into, you know, to big issues. Often we see, Kevin, to that point, it's not just the big obvious things, but it's the incremental changes.
Yeah.
People start noticing, you know, we had a case where the operations director of a firm was using the firm's data to augment his lifestyle. You know, flashier watches, faster cars, and it wasn't until ultimately the financial controller of the organization started dating him and realized the gifts that they were receiving were slightly exorbitant, that they put 2 and 2 together. So it's not just the big things, it's also the incremental changes. But people see these stuff, but somehow most firms find there's a gap between seeing them and feeling comfortable and supported in reporting.
Can I bring you down into this? I mean, under the new legislation that mirrors the Bribery Act in the UK, our Corporate Offences Act, there is an ongoing obligation on organisations to train their people and implement new policies effective from last July, effectively. Is this something that you're seeing more and more of, or what would you like to see corporates in Ireland doing in relation to those policies?
Yeah, well, I suppose since Section 19 was brought in, or Section 18, sorry, of the Corruption Offence Act was brought in, I'm certainly seeing my request to speak at things more frequently. And people seem to have an interest in bribery and corruption, and corporates do. Whereas before, there didn't seem to be as much an interest. Certainly, no one was contacting us to go and speak at events in relation to bribery and corruption. I suppose the Section 18 is very important, and I suppose the most important thing if you're thinking about bribery and corruption prevention is a risk assessment. Is to look at your business, see what is your business. Is it in a high-risk industry, you know, or is it in a high-risk geography? So think about where you do your business and what you do your business. Do you have agents involved? Do you have local fixers? So these are all big red flags that you could be exposed to corruption or bribery. And I suppose we can learn, maybe in Ireland can learn from the UK here with the Bribery Act 2010. It's really about having a living prevention policy. There's no good when this new act came out now, doing up risk assessment, doing up an anti-bribery and corruption policy and putting it in a drawer. You really have to actively engage with your staff, have active training if that's appropriate, if that's what you decide on, and update your policy as events happen. Now, in Ireland, the Oireachtas hasn't chosen to give particular guidance on what they see as you know, the appropriate prevention measures and all due diligence. But the UK, they have a guidance document that might be a good place to start, and I'm sure a lot of businesses have looked at that already.
No, absolutely. I think one of the key issues for our kind of listeners is that, you know, the only prosecution that's taken place under the Bribery Act in the UK was basically related to a dormant company. They had all their policies and procedures, no one just knew about them. You know, there was no active training, there was no communication. It wasn't a living document or framework as such, and so that's the expectations of the regulator now. Looking into to Steve, if I could, I've got a question from Ian Hines. He said, how do the ACI and other external panelists manage inconsistent cross-border legislative and statutory requirements and demands? Now, I think this is something we've all come across. You know, if you have differing legislation in differing jurisdiction, what trumps, which one do you look at first, and how do you manage that within an investigation?
Yeah, well, let's be clear. You know, all of those types of corporate investigations, they're looked at through a multidisciplinary lens, and they inevitably will see external counsel in those jurisdictions instructed to advise on precisely those matters. So it's important in the context of a really big a big investigation of the type that Ian's describing, that there are many moving parts and many disciplines involved in that decision-making process. But I would say, even for the external lawyers, let's be fair, they're not always easy.
And Declan, I know you've done some cross-border investigations. Is this something you've come across in your practice?
Certainly, yeah, there is a great disparity between the bar for regulators in different jurisdictions. And I suppose if your client has operations in each of those jurisdictions, then they need to comply in each of those jurisdictions. One can't decide, well, we're going to comply with the Irish regulator because it's simpler or more straightforward, or we understand it better. If you're in these jurisdictions, you've got to maintain your compliance in all of them. And that will be tricky, and it will require you to source local advice in each jurisdiction you're operating in. And it may lead to inter-regulator cooperation in due course. And you mentioned Airbus and the bit of controversy there between the various regulators in different jurisdictions. It might be a matter for the regulators down the road, if you can demonstrate that you've complied with them as far as you can, to decide among themselves who takes the lead. But certainly you can't, as a client, decide, well, we tick the boxes over here and decide not to do something over there because it doesn't suit us to do so, or it's going to be too difficult or too costly.
Yeah, well, I'm looking and I'm conscious of our time now. We've got lots of questions in. I think, you know, this is a space that we're going to see grow and grow in Ireland in terms of awareness, but also, you know, in terms of enforcement. And I think when that enforcement activity ramps up, you know, in the space that we're in, certainly clients will be far more conscious about what it means when an investigation happens and what can potentially go wrong and the potential consequences of it. So just to wrap up, I want to thank all of our lovely panelists. Thank you so much for your time, both today and in rehearsal. You've really added an awful lot in terms of, you know, the different sphere that it comes together in terms of any investigation. I think one of the takeaways from this is that it's a collaborative process. You know, while our firms might be in competition with each other, you know, the investigation space is pretty small, and us practitioners all pretty know each other anyway. And it's a great way of informing each other of how we best do or improve our practices, but also, you know, watching the next big thing come up. And so it'll be an interesting space to watch over the coming months. On that, today's listeners, you'll get an email from us with a recording of today's webinar. Please feel free to circulate that as widely as you'd like. You'll also get a survey, and please do try and fill that out. It's very helpful for us at MHC just to get feedback from the listeners and see how we can better do the next webinar. And speaking of which, that takes place next Tuesday, the 7th of July. That'll be part 2 of our investigations series. It will look at specifically the obstacles in investigations, and primarily internal investigations. So what obstacles are faced, what happens when you lose privilege or you inadvertently disclose information to regulations and so on, and what can you do to mitigate the risks that's rising from those obstacles. We'll have speakers again from a broad range of organizations. We'll have Inventus, which is a London-based document disclosure and intelligence IA, basically, or AI, artificial intelligence firm. We'll have FRA, who are the firm that led the Airbus investigation, and also Nardello, which is another investigations firm that looks at various investigations on a cross-border basis. So thank you from both Liam, myself, and Declan Black, our managing partner. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you for watching, and we'll hope to hear from you soon. Thank you very much.